History often remembers Charlemagne as a monument, a crowned emperor, a conqueror, a name that seems to stand above his age. But before he became a symbol, he was a man ruling in a world where power rarely lasted. When Charlemagne came to the throne in the late 8th century, Europe was not waiting to be unified. It was fractured, uneven, and uncertain. The Roman Empire in the West had collapsed long before his birth, leaving behind memories, ruins, and expectations, but no functioning center. Roads still crossed the land. Churches still stood. Laws were still spoken aloud. Yet no single authority bound them together. Power survived locally, personally, and temporarily. Charlemagne was born into a ruling family, but not into stability. His father, Pepin the Short, had taken the Frankish crown only a generation earlier, replacing a dynasty that had ruled in name but not in strength. The Carolingian throne was new, and legitimacy was still fragile. Kingship was not secured by institutions. It had to be proven repeatedly. When Charlemagne became king in 768, he did not rule alone. The Frankish kingdom was divided between him and his brother, Charlemagne, a common arrangement that rarely ended peacefully. Authority was shared, boundaries were unclear, and loyalty was divided. For 3 years, the future of the kingdom remained uncertain. Then Charlemagne died suddenly. Charlemagne emerged as sole ruler, not through conquest but circumstance. Yet ruling alone brought its own dangers. A Frankish king without momentum risked losing the loyalty of nobles who expected reward, protection, and success. To rule was not simply to sit on a throne. It was to move, to act, and to demonstrate control. From the beginning, Charlemagne ruled as a campaigning king. Nearly every year of his reign involved military action. He led armies across rivers, forests, and mountain passes, into Saxony, into Italy, into regions where Frankish authority was weak or contested. These were not brief wars of ambition. They were long, exhausting struggles, often fought over the same territories again and again. The Saxon Wars alone would stretch across decades, marked by rebellion, suppression, forced integration, and renewed resistance. Victory did not bring peace. It brought responsibility and new instability. To modernize, this constant warfare can appear excessive. But in Charlemagne's world, stillness was dangerous. A king who stopped moving risked losing control. Loyalty was sustained through presence, reward, and fear faded quickly in the absence of force. Charlemagne's power rested not only on what he conquered, but on how often he appeared. He did not rule from a fixed capital. He traveled endlessly, holding court wherever he went. Disputes were judged in person. Oaths were sworn face to face. Authority was reinforced by visibility. For those under his rule, power was not abstract. It arrived with the king himself. Yet expansion brought a problem that conquest could not solve. By the late 8th century, Charlemagne ruled over a vast and diverse territory. Franks, Saxons, Lombards, Bavarians, peoples with different customs, laws, and loyalties, now fell under his authority. Communication was slow. Travel took weeks or months. Orders weakened as they moved outward. Local elites still held real power on the ground. Charlemagne could defeat enemies. Governing what followed was far more difficult. The more land he controlled, the more fragile his rule became. Power in the early medieval world was not self-sustaining. It had to be reinforced constantly. Every victory created new obligations. Every alliance required maintenance. Every region demanded attention. Charlemagne's reign was defined not by a single triumph, but by the continuous effort to keep authority from unraveling. It was during these years, not at his coronation, not at the height of conquest, that the deeper challenge of his rule emerged. How could power last beyond the ruler? How could authority be made reliable in a world where loyalty was personal, institutions were thin, and memory faded quickly? These were not abstract questions. They shaped every decision Charlemagne made as his reign continued. They pushed him toward new ways of organizing rule, toward law, administration, and partnership with institutions that could outlive him. The answer would not come quickly, and it would never be complete. But it was here, in the tension between movement and control, between conquest and governance, that Charlemagne's reign began to transform from personal rule into something closer to structure. And it is there, in that transformation, that the true story of his power begins. As Charlemagne's rule expanded, movement alone was no longer enough. Presence could intimidate, reward, and command, but it could not be everywhere at once. Distance diluted authority. Time weakened memory, and every absence created opportunity for local power to reassert itself. To govern such a wide realm, Charlemagne needed more than loyalty. He needed structure. He began by relying on a familiar figure, the count. Counts were appointed to govern regions in the king's name. They collected revenues, enforced justice, and raised troops when called. In theory, they represented royal authority. In practice, they were local men, rooted in local interests, and capable of becoming powers in their own right. This tension lay at the heart of medieval rule. Delegation was necessary, but dangerous. Charlemagne did not attempt to eliminate this risk. He attempted to manage it. Oversight became essential. To monitor local officials, Charlemagne created a system of royal envoys known as missi dominici. They traveled in pairs, usually one noble and one cleric, moving through assigned regions to inspect courts, hear complaints, and report back directly to the king. The pairing was deliberate. Secular authority balanced by religious legitimacy. Local power checked by external presence. This system did not replace local rule. It hovered above it. It reminded counts that authority was borrowed, not owned. Law, too, became a tool of control. Charlemagne did not impose a single legal code across his empire. Instead, he ordered existing laws to be written down, clarified, and coordinated. Royal decrees, known as capitularies, addressed specific problems. Military obligations, justice, landholding, church conduct. These were not abstract reforms. They were practical responses to disorder. Writing mattered here. A spoken command faded with distance. A written one endured. Literacy was power. Religion provided the infrastructure that made this possible. The church already possessed networks that crossed regions and generations. Bishops, monasteries, and clergy offered continuity in a world where political authority shifted often. Charlemagne leaned heavily on this advantage. He supported church reform not only to shape belief but to shape governance. Clergy were expected to be educated, disciplined, and capable of administration. Monasteries became centers of learning and record-keeping. Religious uniformity helped create administrative predictability. Faith and power were not separate spheres. They were intertwined. Education followed the same logic. Charlemagne encouraged learning not as an intellectual luxury, but as a necessity of rule. Officials needed to read laws accurately. Clergy needed to teach doctrine consistently. Errors in text could become errors in authority. The effort to standardize writing, preserve texts, and train scholars, later called the Carolingian Renaissance, was less a cultural awakening than an administrative strategy. Knowledge made governance possible. Yet for all these developments, the system remained fragile. Counts still depended on local support. Missi could not be everywhere. Laws required enforcement. The church itself varied in discipline and loyalty. Above all, the system depended on Charlemagne's continued attention. He still traveled constantly. He still presided over assemblies. He still acted as the final authority. Structure existed, but it had not replaced the ruler. It rested on him. The more Charlemagne built, the clearer this dependence became. Institutions were forming, but they were not yet self-sustaining. Authority had been organized, but not secured. The question of succession, of what would happen when the king was no longer present, remained unresolved. And then, in the year 800, Charlemagne entered Rome. What followed would redefine how his power was understood, not just by those who lived under him, but by generations who came after. The moment would elevate his authority. It would also expose the limits of everything he had built. When Charlemagne entered Rome in the winter of the year 800, the moment was carefully staged and heavy with memory. The city still carried the weight of empire, even if its power had long faded. To be crowned there was to step into history itself. During a religious ceremony, Charlemagne was crowned emperor. To later generations, this moment would seem inevitable, the culmination of decades of conquest and rule. But to those who understood the world Charlemagne lived in, the coronation raised as many questions as it answered. An emperor was not simply a king with a larger title. Empire carried expectations, protection of the church, maintenance of order, authority that extended beyond personal loyalty. The crown linked Charlemagne not only to Rome's past, but to its burdens. Symbolically, the coronation mattered immensely. It fused political authority with religious legitimacy. It suggested continuity where fragmentation had reigned. It created an image of unity powerful enough to outlast the reality beneath it. But the structures of empire remained thin. Charlemagne did not suddenly gain new institutions. He still governed through counts, envoys, assemblies, and personal oversight. Distance remained a problem. Communication remained slow. Loyalty remained personal. The imperial title elevated expectations faster than the system could support them. As Charlemagne aged, the strain became visible. He worked to manage succession, attempting to divide authority among his heirs in a way that would preserve unity. Yet division had always been the Frankish way. Power shared was power weakened. No administrative system yet existed that could override family claims, regional interests, and personal ambition. When Charlemagne died in 814, the system he had built was tested without him. It did not hold. Within a generation, the empire fragmented. Authority splintered among heirs and local powers. Central oversight faded. The structures Charlemagne created proved unable to survive without the presence that had sustained them. Yet to see this as failure is to misunderstand his legacy. Charlemagne did not leave behind a permanent empire. What he left behind was a way of thinking about power. He demonstrated that authority could be organized, that kingship could be more than conquest and charisma. Law could be written, oversight could exist, institutions could support rule even if imperfectly. Later rulers returned to his example again and again. They invoked his name. They borrowed his symbols. They pursued the same balance between force, faith, and administration that he had attempted. Not because his system had endured, but because the problem he faced had not disappeared. The medieval world continued to struggle with the same question Charlemagne had confronted: how to make power last beyond the person who holds it. Charlemagne's reign stands at the center of that struggle. Not as a solution, but as an attempt, ambitious, incomplete, and deeply influential. His legacy is not unity, but structure. Not permanence, but possibility. And in that sense, Charlemagne did not rebuild an empire. He reshaped how power itself was imagined in the medieval world. That imagination, fragile, contested, and always unfinished, would shape history long after the crown had passed from his head into memory.